We're glad you joined us today for Austin Faith Dialogue, when we'll be talking with an expert about the whole notion of African spirituality and how that influences the New World. Stay with us for Austin Faith Dialogue.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion in life, produced by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
We're glad you joined us for Austin Faith Dialogue. We have a special treat today. There has been, in the latter part of February, a conference on the African diaspora and the modern world organized by the University of Texas and UNESCO. We're fortunate to have one of the presenters at that conference here with us today to talk about his research, his understanding of African spirituality, and help us understand a little bit more about that whole area of research. Our guest today is Dr. Olabi Yai. He's chair of the Department of African and Asian Languages and Literatures at the University of Florida at Gainesville. And it's a real treat to have you, Dr. Yai. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about how so far the conference has been going, what you've seen and heard, and what some of the hopes are for this gathering of international scholars?
Well, this conference is unique in a way. As you said, it was a conference of the UNESCO and the University of Texas. We launched the idea of a conference on African diaspora, on the slave route in Africa. And it was quite normal that we start the second conference here in Austin, in a country which has received so many slaves. I say it is unique because this is the first time in my experience that we have descendants of Africans from the diaspora, particularly from the southern part of America and the Caribbean. Most of the time when we have UNESCO conferences, descendants of a slave were not represented, but this time we have representatives of communities themselves who speak for themselves and bring their own problem and issues, and so far it has been a very good experience.
That's right. That's one of the beauties, I think, of this particular event, is it's not only scholars, but it's grassroots people also.
Yeah, grassroots people, artists, practitioners, and community leaders are present, as well as people who are only academically interested in the diaspora.
Now, to get us started, since the show is aimed at people of a variety of religious backgrounds in the Austin area, maybe you can say a little something about, I know Africa is a huge area, so we're talking about an entire continent, but perhaps you can help us understand a little bit about African notions of God, the deity, to set the stage for our conversation here.
Okay, I will limit myself to African traditional religions, not Islam, not Christianity, because in a sense we can also say that Christianity and Islam are also African religions, having been there for many centuries and having been Africanized in a way. So I limit myself to what we call African traditional religions. The concept of God, Africans see themselves as splits of God, as splits from the divine. So they are part of the divine, and they see God as at the same time as transcendent. So it is very difficult for people to understand that, because we in the Abrahamic tradition we see God as very distant and very essentially transcendent. But Africans see God also as immanent to themselves. That's why they can receive God in possession, which you find everywhere in Africa and, of course, in the diaspora here too. And because God is within us and also outside, we need intermediaries. That's why we have ancestors and other deities that allow us to have access to God. But many of them, not just one. In the same way as I believe Christians have the Messiah or Jesus Christ, who is the intermediary between us, human beings, and God.
And now you're in Austin to present a paper which has a different sort of slant on the concept of nation, bringing in African traditional religion in a way that some of us here in the United States may not have thought about. How does that relate to this whole notion of God?
Yes. The concept of nation I am trying to explore in the New World here, particularly in Brazil, has to do with the fact that when people refer to themselves as belonging to this nation or that nation, this means that they have a religious affiliation. As you know, many African deities have a specific origin, a specific birthplace, as they say so, be it mythical or actually historical. Now, someone who belongs to a specific deity will think or will feel, will be made to believe that he is also a citizen of that particular of the birthplace of the and the nation of the god, even irrespective of where he or she is born himself.
So political boundaries really have no meaning then?
No. It is mostly, the concept of nation has the definitory feature there is religious more than political, so that people can be, let's say, we were born in Yoruba, but have a god which is in let's say, a Fon area. They will define themselves as Fon, as well as, of course, born into Yoruba land. Which means that one can have many identities or many nationalities, if I may say so.
Okay.
That's the concept of nation, and that has been transferred to the New World, particularly as many Africans do not have any particular allegiance to an African country after many years or centuries of presence in the America. They may know where they originated from, but they don't have a political allegiance, but they do have a religious allegiance to the chosen nation.
Now, you mentioned Brazil as an example of a place where you can see this very clearly.
Yes.
Are there places in the United States where we might be able to see that people from Africa, as you see, don't have a particular political allegiance, but it's more an allegiance to their god or gods?
I can only think of Louisiana with Vodou, the Gullah areas in the Carolinas, and the new, but this is a new creation, Oyotunji village, an African-American village in South Carolina, which has adopted African ways of African religiosity, where they have allegiance to, not political, but religious allegiance in the term explained as a nation. They belong to the nation of the god that originated, that the birthplace of the god, which is their own personal god. They would think that they are citizens of that area or that nation.
Now, in traditional religions in the United States, well, some of the mainline religions,
Yes.
there is a notion of being able to convert from one to the other as you become convinced of perhaps a greater truth in another religion. Say a Christian becoming Jewish, or someone who is Jewish converting to Islam, or any of the other major faith groups. How is that the same or different in African traditional religions?
It is somewhat different, because I guess conversion is a feature of universal religion, or religion that see human beings as universal beings without seeing them individuals. Now in Africa, as I said, Africans have an individual relation with their God, or the intermediary God that relates them to the supreme being. Therefore, if you have a God as an intermediary to a supreme being, and I have a different God, I cannot convert to your God, because you are viewed as an individual that cannot possibly be confused with any other individual. That is a consequence of the concept of a human being as splits of God. So each split is a unique. So it is not, and since we are all share in the essence of God, there is no sense in converting. We already have that essence of God, but you as an individual relate to God in an individual manner, and you cannot change your individuality for another one. So there is no possibility of conversion in that that sense, because we don't see things in universalist perspective, but in very individual, the personhood and relationship to God.
Well, I wonder if there's a sense then that at least during one's individual lifetime, one's knowledge of the God and closeness to the God, if that grows and changes.
Yes, that definitely. Indeed, the whole religious life consists in reinforcing the life force that animates us and that links us with God. And the older you are, the stronger you are supposed to have that power that we call Ashe in West Africa, particularly in Yoruba. That Ashe, that is the life force that links you to God. That God-like principle that animates every human being and every being indeed, every creature, has to be reinforced daily through sacrifice, through prayers, through communication with the ancestors, etc. So that's where age is very important for us.
So you've talked about specific practices of sacrifice and prayer and communication with ancestors.
Yes.
In religions, mainline religions here in the United States, an important feature is gathering as a community, corporate worship or group something. How does that play out, or does it in African traditional religions?
Good, it does. As I said, people have their individual gods, but if my God happens to be the same as yours, in a village, all people who belong to have the same God as intermediary to the Supreme Being will gather every week. And every week for us means every 4 days. We have a 4-day week at a temple, a shrine, or in one of the devotees' house. We'll make sacrifices, prayers, chants to the God. But other people who are not devotees could also join in, of that God, could join as observers. But those who are devotees of the same God gather every week. That, in other words, we have every day is a Sunday for us. Since we have 4 days, and each individual has his or her own God, there is no day that is not a God's day.
That's a nice image of folks constantly being in worship. And are these corporate gatherings a requirement in the same sense that they almost are for mainline denominations?
Absolutely, they are requirements every 4 days. Now, every day also, individual can pour libation or make personal prayers to a God in their own home. That's a different matter. But the gathering has to occur every week, which is every 4 days. It is mandatory. Yes.
Okay. Dr. Guy, we'll have some more questions for you in just a moment. We want you to look a little bit and learn a little bit about Austin Faith Dialogue, and we'll be back with some questions for Dr. Yai. Stay with us.
Serving Austin means serving you. That has always been the primary goal of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. We are Religion in Action through the work of these organizations. Each plays a key role in making the capital city a better place to live, but we can't do it alone. Do you have some spare time, talents, or any resources that you can share? If you do, please call AMM at 472-7627 because serving Austin means serving you.
We're glad you stayed with us for Austin Faith Dialogue today. I'm Sandy Wilder, your host, and we're having a fascinating conversation with Dr. Olabi Yai, who is chair of the Department of African and Asian Languages and Literatures at the University of Gainesville in Florida. And Dr. Yai, you've been here for a conference on the African diaspora, so this is a good chance for us to get to know something about the religious traditions of a very important part of the world. And one of the things that perhaps you can say a little bit about is the whole notion of religious tolerance. Because I know this conference on the UT campus was organized as part of the United Nations International Year for Tolerance. How is the whole notion of tolerance important to African traditional religions?
Yes. Indeed, I will say that tolerance is a concept that came to us as we were in contact with world religions. It is not a concept that it is quite irrelevant in the African context because, as I say, each one has individual contact with God, and they also assemble as people belonging to the same deity. And in such a context, you don't need a conversion because you, as a split of God and as someone who is an individual, a person related to God, you don't need to, you have to tolerate the other as another person who relates in his own way or her own way through her own deity to God. It is when religions like Islam first and maybe Christianity came and started talking about conversion that we realize that there is a concept called religious tolerance because has never been an issue in Africa, given the nature of African religion. So far as I can say, the African religions in Africa, yesterday and today, have tried to live in good relationship with other religions, although Islam and Christianity saw themselves as missionary in a missionary's position vis-a-vis African traditional religion. But yet, I think people who believe in African religion will go to church when they are invited, for instance, or go to mosque, or at the important moment in the religious life or calendar of Christianity or Islam, like Christmas, like Easter, and like Eid-e-Kabir for the Muslim. They will go and participate and sacrifice. In other words, the family, for instance, I come from a family where we have Muslims. I myself, I am a traditional religion. We have Christians. I have Christian in my family, Catholic and Protestant, Methodist, and I have many Muslims as well. When, of course, we have the family deity gathering, we invite those who are Muslims to come, and they do come. Some don't, because they see it as detracting them from Islam. Some Christians don't. Most Christians will come. But when they have their own festival also, we go to church, to burials, to marriages in the church with them as well. So I think the ethics of African religions is live and let live. Tolerance is has always been there because it was not an issue. But when it was, we were confronted with that issue, we acted naturally. Well, if you are a split of God, whatever your religion, you are a human being, a godlike person. So you don't really need to be antagonistic.
Right, and that's a very different place to begin with from where some other religions began. How has your religious background and your upbringing influenced now what you do as a scholar at the university?
That's a good question. Before I went to school, to official school, I was in a traditional school with my grandmother and my grandfather. I was very fortunate to have been very cultured in the traditions. And indeed, if I am now in African studies and African cultures in the diaspora, it is because I have a solid background. My first education was with diviners, sages who came to see my grandfather and my grandmother. Then, of course, I went to a missionary school, and then you have to at least confess superficial Christianity. If not, you don't go to school. But I go to school, I receive a Christian doctrine as all school boys and girls, and then when I come back home, I still live in the atmosphere of the African gods and African worldviews and practices. I never saw that as a conflict. I saw that as very different. There are things I don't believe in Christianity because my background, African background, was already solid.
So you simply learned how to live in those two worlds.
Two worlds, very comfortably.
And now in the world of a scholar at the university level, what's your particular field of expertise and your contribution to scholarship?
I am professor of Yoruba language. Yoruba is spoken in West Africa. We are 35 million Yoruba people. And it is arguably the language and culture that has the deepest influence in the New World in terms of religion, in terms of language, in terms of culture. It was a kind of cement that brought Africans together in the resistance to complete annihilation by slavery and Western ways. You have Yoruba culture here in the United States, in Cuba, in Brazil, in Trinidad. So my background with my training, indeed, with my grandfather and the diviners and traditionists around him made me go back to African studies after I schooled in France. And I think, well, after doing languages, linguistics, and the Latin American studies, I want to go back to my traditions. Then I went back again and did research on oral performance, African worldviews and African religion, and also the extension of Yoruba culture in the New World.
Now, if we were to go looking then for Yoruba culture, say, even here in Austin, Texas, where might we find some traces in the culture, in the foods, in the religion?
I am not quite familiar with Austin, but in many cities now in the United States, there are small Yoruba groups, people, not Africans, but African American, who rediscover as a voluntary gesture, want to rediscover their roots or give themselves a root, and they are interested in Yoruba culture. Sometimes they will import a Yoruba priest from home and get initiated. You have many of them in New York, in Chicago, of course in Miami, in Atlanta. And I think someone told me that even in Texas there are a few scattered in Texas, some Yoruba families, people who practice Yoruba culture and religion. They have Yoruba temples. Yeah.
If you were to say to an American, a Texas audience, some message, let's say, from the Yoruba religion particularly, what would you say to us, or some important things, say, that we could learn from you?
Well, what I could say is that we are all part of the Supreme Being, irrespective of race, sex, country of birth, etc. And we have to reinforce that godly belonging or godly feature in us, irrespective of our denomination, and therefore understand or tolerance you cannot be tolerant if you don't understand the other. In other words, there is a lot of misunderstanding of African religions and African cultures in general in the United States, in the mainstream United States. The message I will therefore have is to start being interested in African cultures, and indeed have some lectures on African cultures, including in schools, because we must invest in the new generation if we want to really promote understanding and therefore tolerance among people, among religions. That will be my message. I believe that Yoruba worldview, that all human beings, not only Yoruba, are split from God. Therefore, I don't see any difference apart from the way we communicate with God, each one in its own channel. But as splits of God, there is no doubt that we are.
We might look different and act different, but
yes,
but we are basically all brothers and sisters.
Therefore, I come from a village. When you are brother and sister, the first thing is to know your brother and sister. You have to be interested in whatever she is interested in. In that sense, I believe that Africa is so much part of this country. People either African or non-African descent should also be interested in African cultures, and it should be part of the curricula in school, and that's the way to promote understanding.
And who knows, from your presence here today, that might actually happen. Thank you, Dr. Yai.
As always, thank you.
And thank all of you for tuning in to Austin Faith Dialogue today for our conversation about how we really are all one in this year of tolerance. We're glad you joined us. We'll look forward to seeing you again next week on Austin Faith Dialogue.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.